the biggest takeaway so far, in my opinion, has been that in the Renaissance, a frame maker and a painter had the same value. And this is, of course, strange to a modern man. And then you have the start of the separation with Charles Bateau when he introduces the concept of fine art in 1746. And with good intentions, of course, but it led to a lot of bad things. And then you have the Encyclopedia, I think the edition of 1951, where art is no longer placed in the category of reason, which is also a very defining moment. And then, as we touched upon in the last episode, when Kant writes that basically he described the ready-mades 200 years, or well, roughly 150 years before they even appeared.
Yeah.
So, do you have any other insight into?
That's the good thing about that book. It comes with concrete information, like the function of the museum, and that the basic principles of the system of fine art came to be radically different from what we call old master or classical painting. So that you can say, without being funny or polemical or sarcastic, you can say that Rembrandt actually did not make art, because it does not satisfy those criteria, quite simply. And I cannot emphasize that point enough. I mean, you can agree or disagree with the idea of kitsch as a name for classical culture, but if people at least can come to accept what art actually is, not what we dream it is, but what it actually is, then we can build something. And reading that book is fundamental in order to get there.
And also it's important then to, again, clarify that it's art with a capital A. That we're talking about. That Rembrandt didn't make art with a capital A.
Yeah.
Because this is a word that comes into the language in the 1750s, around that time. With the fine art, and then they shortened it to art after that. Which is something completely different from how the word was used previously, which meant science and the art of painting.
Knowledge, speaking of what you said, that it goes from art with a small a means just the knowledge of or the discipline of doing this or that, and there are objective rational principles that you can follow to learn or acquire that skill. Whereas with fine art there are no objective rules, so-called. Of course there are commandments, but there are no rules that can teach you, that you can follow.
Yeah, and already in the 1750s art is no longer placed in the category of reason. From the major, the Encyclopedia was supposed to guide people, illuminate, or give knowledge to all classes of society. So they defined the standard.
Yeah, so it's a value system that comes in and attacks classical values from all sides, saying that craft is mechanical, and that storytelling is old-fashioned and sentimental, and we don't need it anymore, and that everything is subjective. So you go away from the objective criteria, and those three things are of the most grave importance for classical culture. So I mean, if you read that book and still talk about that I'm an artist and all these things, it's like the moth flying around the candlelight and flying into the candlelight in the end, because you think it's the sun. You get burnt up. It's pointless.
And then also an important takeaway from this book is how the museums turned the paintings into painting for painting's sake, or the paintings for the sake of paintings. They didn't have a clear function anymore, other than being looked at out of context in a museum, together with a lot of, as if you're putting a lot of people in prison, and we're just supposed to their own view for us.
Yeah, well, that's a nice analogy. It's what they do with prisoners. You're just a number. You're not a human being anymore. Yeah. And that's what they do. They, like you read about Louvre, that they intentionally put paintings into Louvre to neutralize them. But then they also neutralize the crafts and the ability to create stories that are in those paintings.
And again, the context here is that the lower classes were angry at the upper classes with the French Revolution, and therefore they put them in the museum, all the paintings from the noble class, to give people a distance to them, like a historical distance, so they wouldn't destroy them. That was the intention. Yeah. And again, it's like there are good intentions leading to the path of hell. It's all the way here.
Yeah.
Yeah. And last time we ended roughly around the end of the 18th century, and now we come to the 19th century, which is where we start to see how the painters, as we've talked about before, they start to talk as modernists, but although they are not, it has not fully manifested in their work. Yeah. So this chapter here is called "Art Becomes an Independent Realm," and I will just read one paragraph here. Although it would be impossible to say exactly when and where an abstract capitalized art with its own internal but general principles first emerged, such a concept was firmly in place by the 1830s. In 1835, one French critic remarked that, quote, "Instead of the fine arts, we have art," with a capital A, "the new king of the century," unquote. That same year, Théophile Gautier wrote of art for art's sake in the preface to Mademoiselle de Maupin, and Emerson's 1836 lectures spoke of art as a, quote, "department of life," unquote, alongside religion, science, and politics. Yet art was a separate realm not only in concept and language, but in its separate institutions as well. In the visual arts, separate auctions, dealers, and museums had become an established feature of European life by the 1830s. Music and literature also underwent further changes in both conception and institutional forms during the first half of the century that accentuated their separation from their former functional contexts. And the 1830s, that's around the time when Hegel starts preaching about art. And he's also, as we have talked about before, he's very relevant to the modern system of art because of the categorization of periods in history, and that you cannot paint like Rembrandt in the 2000s, for example. And there was something interesting that Scheiner mentioned here, so I will continue a little bit. And he's first mentioning a critic which is later on, which I think Michael Pearce touched upon. Even a formalist critic like Clive Bell, if that rings a bell, who denied artworks any reference beyond themselves, could write in 1914 that the experience of art is, quote, "so valuable that I have been tempted to believe that art might prove the world's salvation," unquote. One outgrowth of this reification of art was the attempt to identify which of the fine arts was closest to the essence of art. And this is interesting. Whether conceived as a spirit, will, life, feeling, or form, many poets, but also several philosophers such as Hegel and Comte, were deeply convinced that poetry most fully exemplified the essence of art. Hegel argued that poetry was closer to spirit than the sensuous media of sound, color, or stone.
That's Hegel. That's the same point as Kant is making.
Exactly the same.
Yeah, they abstract science.
Yeah. So painting is not interesting to them anymore because it's sensuous. You have to paint the human face, and then there's no imagination left for the viewer. That's kind of the point. That with the poetry, it's all in the mind.
It's interesting, and that leads to, for example, Thomas Kulka, when he writes Kitchen Art, to talk about kitsch as pre-digested.
Yes, exactly. Pre-digested, that's a good term for this. And it's the same with music. It's a bit similar with music. So, going a bit further here, the primary reason many writers gave for viewing instrumental music as the highest art was that it seemed the least worldly of all the arts, having no purpose beyond its intrinsic pleasures. So it's all about what happens up here and no longer about reality.
Yeah, so you could even argue that music is more arty than poetry because you cannot see the tones.
Yeah. It's even more abstract.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting something he mentions here about how culture, that term was changed in the 19th century. A term closely related to art that also changed its meaning in the 19th century was culture. In the 18th century, culture signified a social distinction between the cultivated and the ignorant or unmannered. Culture was something one had more or less of as a cultivated person, although some 19th century writers such as Matthew Arnold made culture a near synonym for fine art. Its more general meaning usually included all the higher intellectual activities such as history, philosophy, or even the sciences. Late 19th century historians and anthropologists made its scope even broader by reviving Herder's use of culture. He's a student of Kant, so it's all connected to Kant here. Herder's use of culture as a general term for the totality of behavior, belief, and institutions of a society. So way more broad concept, and you're just watering out that concept. So in the end, a cultivated person, it doesn't mean anything. It's not someone who has read a lot and has a lot of knowledge about the world and is a well-mannered person. It's just whatever happens in society.
And that's sort of the quote-unquote democratic mindset of the whole thing, that everything is included, and then of course you go away from the classical values because they set some higher bar for you.
And I have some quotes here from, various poets, painters, and I guess composers, which could be interesting to read to learn how they were thinking in the 19th century about art. And it could also be interesting to look at some examples from that book eventually. So the first quote here is from William Blake, and he wrote in 1820, quote, "A poet, a painter, a musician, an architect, the man or woman who is not one of these is not a Christian." The religious motifs are recurring a lot here. "You must leave father and mother and house and land if they stand in the way of art," with a capital A, unquote. And then another one here. One critic remarked in 1834, quote, "The despot of the day is the word artist. In the old days one said of good artists that they had beliefs, but art itself is a belief." Again, art with a capital A. "The true artist is the priest of this eternal religion," unquote. And another quote here. "Divine art, I carry you in my soul. Let me be worthy of you."
I remember that one. That sort of burnt itself into my mind.
So, Boris has talked about this before, right? That Christianity in the 19th century became very, very, how is the way he described it? Very, very spiritual, like otherworldly kind of, and very, very deep religious times. You see also with Babettes Gjestebud.
By Karen Blixen.
Yeah. And then art gets mixed into this and kind of becomes a surrogate religion in the end, as I think Scheiner describes somewhere.
The whole idea is that the artist taps into like the main pulse of humanity and shows us what is at the bottom of our souls and all of this cliche.
And then another quote here, Mussorgsky, "The artist is a law unto himself."
That's Kant.
Yeah.
And that's interesting because I haven't really listened much to Mussorgsky, but he didn't. Did he in a way turn modern or?
No, but that's the thing, right?
Yeah.
It's the language.
Yeah.
And it just hasn't manifested yet.
Yeah.
And well, you mentioned Kant, and we should perhaps take that into the context of the critique of judgment, because he says that, how does he phrase it, about the genius?
Yeah,
the genius makes the rule, nature makes
law, how is it? The nature gives the law.
The nature gives the rule to, genius gives the rule to nature.
Nature gives the rule to art through the genius. I forget the exact quote.
The point is that the genius makes the
genius is a medium.
Yeah. A medium?
A medium, like some kind of a shaman, but not in...
Yeah, like a god.
Yeah.
That's, that you can put nature aside for the genius. And then here's another quote by
but that's
George
also
Sand.
What you've been very concerned with, rightfully so, this idea about creating, that you're creating something. And that's what it comes, that's the change between the old master painter and the genius. The old master painter takes what he sees and has some objective principles to work by and makes an image out of that. But the genius will just make something from himself, so-called.
Yeah, and and that's going back to both Hegel and Kant. They want something which is not sensuous, something that only is up here. And that has to materialize at some point because they become so influential, both of them.
Yeah, well...
And I remember the quote now from Kant, genius gives the rule to art.
Yeah. Can I interject one thing? This is so this is the book, just show a little bit at a certain point, but Swedish modernists.
Yeah.
Or the transitional period, and here it says it's a quote by Josephine Péladin, 1897, about the artist. Their eyes see what you do not.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of what we're talking about there.
Well, but it is.
Yes and no.
True.
Yeah. That's the thing. That's the thing.
Of course. Then when it's interpreted by, could we say, less intelligent people?
Yeah.
It has a very unfortunate result.
Yeah, well, that's why. So it's like a knife's edge when you start talking about these things that we're talking about, because of course, old master painting is not just like Seth Feit was talking about. It's not just copying nature. So there is this so-called something more that isn't where you start to manipulate and tweak and change what you see. But that's not going to surrealism and abstract pop art or whatever. You have to be able to understand the difference between these things, right?
Yeah, it's like Hartwig can show you how beautiful a forest can be.
Yeah, so he sees what you do not. Or you see it afterwards and you think nature is copying Hartwig.
Yeah. And I want to read this quote by George Sand and another quote. To be an artist, yes, I wanted to be one, not only to escape from the material jail, where property large or small imprisons us in a circle of odious little preoccupations, but to isolate myself from the control of opinion, to live away from the prejudices of the world.
It's interesting, very much similar to what Michael Pearce wrote about Proudhon. This thing about
and he was very similar to Hegel, wasn't he, Proudhon?
Yes, communist or socialist thinker.
And then one last quote here from the Goncourts. The artist is a man who lives only for his art.
Yeah.
I think it was in the magazine, so no, correct author.
Yeah, that's interesting. And then it's like the art sociologist Dag Solel has mentioned when he compared on Kitsch, the book On Kitsch, comparing quotes by Munch and how similar they are to Kant, and how similar Kant is to pietist or Puritan psalms.
Yeah. And that's something that comes very strongly back to the religion in the 19th century.
Yeah.
in Scandinavia and I guess in other places, this very Lutheran.
Yes, having a true soul, not being a slave of the senses. And then you get that pure spirituality, which is...
So they kind of, they perfectly align.
Well, can I show you an image now? So this is Fritz Lindström. This is 1898. And it's a very good example of it, this one. Yeah. So what does it do? And so many ways. It's trying to be original. So what does it do? Well, it doesn't paint the eyes, because you're always looking for the eyes in the portrait. I'm not going to paint the eyes because I want to be deep. And so they're not even mentioned there. And then you see this coquettish sketch idea, right? That he doesn't finish it here, so that you see that this is paint on canvas.
Yeah, that starts to happen at that time.
Yeah. And the tragic thing is that you can see, if you look a little bit, there is some skills here. Absolutely. I mean, he could have been something. But then he has to, this is the artification tricks. What you seek for, what you want to meet the other human being, that into human contact, that's forbidden, and that's the aesthetical indifference.
That also becomes more
this is 1898.
It becomes more normal in the 19th century with these painters who put figures in landscapes who are having their back towards us, like Caspar David Friedrich.
Yeah. So you could argue that this there is a distance that comes in there in the same way as so the gray weather comes into painting in the mid-19th century. You go away from the Baroque dramatic lighting into the gray weather, and then there's a difference that sort of comes into it.
And also it was as if Alden knew that we would have this conversation, because he showed me that book and all these portraits by these painters who represent that time right before modernism takes over. And Odd said that look at all these faces, they look so insecure.
Yeah.
Like, and what do you call it? Like they're full of resignation. They don't know what to do. They don't know what to tell you.
Yeah, and then so this is Axel Thurman, 1905. He knows or feels or whatever where the wind is blowing.
Yeah. There's like they paint this. They know that this is the tradition they come from.
Yeah.
But they can feel already that while they're making the brushstroke, it's passé.
Yeah.
It's over.
But and you see many examples of that. Also, this sort of skilled late 19th century painters who are sort of solid draftsmen, and then they're not. I mean, he seems to be a very clear opportunist. I'm going to try to do what is new so I can get some money.
Yeah.
But these painters that are established also just sort of veer into that, because that's where the wind's blowing, and it just becomes sort of half-hearted even as modernism. So it's very strange.
Yeah, and it's similar to what happened during the fall of the Roman Empire. You can see in the crafts, the sculptures that are made at that time, the busts around 200, 300, even in the 200s, but especially in the 300s, it's the level is going dramatically downwards, and you can even they make frog eyes on some people, and it looks cartoonish and stiff. And also the resignation is very clear, even in the faces of the people that are portrayed. So it's similar to what happened back then. Yeah. And it is as we have talked about before, it's a signifier of dangerous times ahead.
Yeah, and you see it very clearly here, that it's about the symbolic value of color. Speaking of Kandinsky, this is 1905. I forget when he wrote this on spiritual and painting, but they're starting to paint like modernists. But this is figurative modernism.
Yeah, it's all about that green jacket.
Yeah, paint as paint on canvas.
But going back a little bit here to the mid 19th century. There's a quite interesting paradox that appears, which Larry Shiner pokes some fun at, because they're starting to painters start to become more well-off because society is more well-off in general.
Yeah.
At the same time, you see the rise of the suffering artist, that cliche. So he writes here, by the 1860s, the income and status of both British and French painters had risen sufficiently for the profession to become a vehicle for modest social ascent. But the image of the genius, misunderstood and rejected, was always there if needed. Although craftsmanship was always held subordinate to the supreme values of imagination and creativity, the sheer application of effort was one sign of artistic vocation, as compared to the nonchalance of the bohemian or dandy images. Although dedicated craftsmanship could combine nicely with the secular saint and martyr syndrome.
Yeah, exactly. As if Titian would ever think like that.
Yeah, it's a little bit like with the communists in Russia, or the communist revolutions that happened all over. That they revolted when they finally had some money, you could say.
Yeah. That's a common thing. With just before the revolutions, things are starting to get better, and then they see that it's almost there, and they want to get there now.
Yeah. So it's a quite funny paradox. And Van Gogh, for example. I have a Dutch wife, so I pronounce it that.
Van Gogh, yeah.
Yeah, Van Gogh. He was very well off, but he has become portrayed later on as this suffering, poor genius.
Yeah.
And there are many other examples. I think Odd said once that the big idea, the ideal is to portray yourself as if you were Jesus.
Yeah.
Born in a little.
Yeah, exactly. And that's that article comparing Monk and Kant and this pietist priest. One of the funniest quotes about the more you lack joy, the more Jesus embraces you. Which is very similar to what Kant is.
Wait. The more you like joy? Lack joy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Which, of course, is if you lack joy, then you know that you're a good person and you can feel good about yourself. Or much better than the others.
Yeah, but the best thing is to be actually well off and to be able to tell people that you had such a terrible upbringing and you fought your way through and you got there in the end. So, I want to read a little bit from a chapter here called The Descent of the Artisan. If the image and status of the artist achieved new heights in the 19th century, that of the artisan or craftsperson sank even lower, as many were forced to give up their independent workshops. Although in the Industrial Revolution used to be talked of as if steam-powered machines swept away the old workshop systems overnight, historians now describe a far more gradual process, varying from region to region, industry to industry. Nevertheless, the disappearance of tens of thousands of small workshops was inexorable, even if it took most of the 19th century to complete. And that's the great tragedy of the 19th century, all the little workshops that disappeared. And I would also argue was the main reason for the revolutions, because people got less, works they couldn't be proud of in factories and
exactly.
Yeah.
And I think so. This is the same thing I thought of when I did this conversation with Michael Pierce. That of course there are, like that, purely cultural historical factors that play a role, but the most important driving factor are the ideas behind the fine art term. And I remember Odd, your father said or wrote how was it? Even though the combustion engine came, people still kept running and having sports.
Yeah.
Because then they don't have any ideas about, oh, you're running in an old-fashioned way or something like that. No kind of philosophy or ideas of purity about it. They still are running, even though the car can drive how many times or go how many times faster. So that wasn't a problem. It's never a problem.
That's a very good point. But it was illegal to make.
Yeah, because
tonal
then
music.
you get into exactly what you're talking about, religion and purity, and I guess purity is the essence of it.
But selectively applied, and that's the point going back to Charles Baton, that he gave these disciplines that he categorized in the fine arts, the death penalty.
Yeah.
Painting, music, sculpture, poetry. And landscape gardening I think was included, but but the main categories, they received a death penalty by him unknowingly.
Yeah, and you maybe come to that, but there's a funny thing at the end where Scheiner talks about this conference of ceramicists, and that they should have a greater pride in being craftsmen, and no one is cheering, no one is saying anything, because of course they want to be artists. But if people can just understand that any discipline that ever gets the term art on it completely falls apart, disintegrates, and is destroyed.
Yeah, and they tried it even with the movies, but it was stopped, fortunately. Well, in the end, I mean, you have to give some people something to entertain themselves by.
Yeah.
But Larry Scheiner continues here to talk about those handcrafts people. So I will read a little bit about that. The workers began to feel a loss of pride and power, and one report expressed fears that although mechanization reduced fatigue by, quote, depriving glassworkers of difficult tasks, we will destroy their skill as well as the artistic talents of which glassworkers have the right to be proud, unquote.
Yeah.
So it comes at a great price, probably greater price.
Take away the difficult tasks.
As traditional methods were displaced in glass blowing, weaving, shoemaking, and woodworking, many artisans were reduced to machine operators. Even so, some masters and journeymen were able to hang on with diminished income until they retired or moved to less industrialized regions. In North America, the visiting Alexis de Tocqueville was impressed by the thousands of small shops he saw in the 1830s, and there were still many in existence 100 years later. As a boy in the late 1940s, I remember watching with fascination the blacksmiths in my grandparents' small Kansas farm town, sharpening plowshares, repairing machinery, and making ornamental ironwork.
Yeah.
In the same era, cities such as Chicago or New York still had neighborhood bakers, tailors, and jewelry makers. Even as late as the 1990s, the independent artisan bakers of Paris with their small family boulangeries were successfully fighting off the arrival of chain operators. Despite such scattered survivals into the age of malls and franchises, the majority of the tens of thousands of small workshops and their handcraft ethos of the 19th century had disappeared by 1914.
Yeah.
It's one of the great tragedies of our time, actually, because you cannot just revive these things by like that.
Well,
it's a broken tradition.
It's a fundamental thing. You know that the skill is in you. It's not in the machine. It's in you, and you are able to tackle difficult problems that are coming. And it's like with and it's that pride in being able to do so. It's like with Gustav Vigeland, that great Norwegian sculptor, growing up with his grandfather on a farm, and all the tools the grandfather had made himself. So he knew how to repair them. He knew all about that, and of course, Vigeland learned to carve, and he became a sculptor.
And in the times ahead, like Sturla Ellingvåg has been talking about that every 1500 years there's a cataclysmic event or something similar. Well, so how are we going to survive when that happens next time?
Yeah, and
they've made the society extremely vulnerable. And Larry Scheiner is like before. He has a bit of a nostalgia coming in here and there.
Yeah, and it's not just nostalgia, because if the electricity is gone, then how can you manage? Where are your skills?
Yeah, but I'm just saying that Larry Scheiner, he reveals his his nostalgia.
Some kind of preference there, yeah.
As the gap between artist and craftsperson increased, so did the tension within the one fine art profession still identified with making for a purpose, architecture. Although practicing architects could not turn their backs completely on serving human needs, many experienced a deep conflict between the ideal of the architect as autonomous artist creating works for visual contemplation and the architect as the designer of useful structures.
That's interesting. They are making something that can be used. You can go into the building and do things there.
Yeah.
But that sort of de-artifies it, because art is not supposed to be. You're not supposed to use it somehow. Or it's not supposed to be practical.
And that's the thing with Le Corbusier, who said about his own buildings, this complex he wanted to build in Paris, that preferably it should be built and no people should ever use those buildings.
Yeah, look at it as an art object.
Yeah. Let me see. Many early 19th century architects, such as Carl Friedrich Schinkel, for example, began to publish collections of both their built and unbuilt designs, arranged without commentary as if they were fine engravings. Schinkel's writings on architecture show him torn between the fine art side and the craft side of the profession, claiming that although many aspects of architecture remained a technical craft, architecture is a fine art, and the architect's real task is to discover the true aesthetic element.
Exactly.
But Schinkel is a great architect. But that's again
There
like the language. It's in the language, but it's not manifested.
Yeah, and
in the
and it's so shocking that speaking of the word being cultured, even though people were extremely cultured, like with Munch, extremely cultured, he still felt old-fashioned when he saw the Expressionists. And then, of course, you're admitting that they have the right away and you need to change. So it lies in the ideas.
And continuing a bit here, if machine technologies tended to reduce the skilled crafts of weaving, shoemaking, or glassblowing to routine labor, the new construction materials and technique of iron, glass, and reinforced concrete required of the architect an engineer's grasp of structural principles and created an even greater tension between the art and craft aspects of architecture. Nothing better illustrates this increased tension than the late 19th century English debate over the call for professional engineering standards for architects. Many architects and art critics vehemently resisted these efforts in the name of fine art and the artist's autonomy, with even John Ruskin and William Morris joining the anti-engineering side. Wow. After the Royal Institute of British Architects began requiring examinations for membership in 1887, and several registration bills came before Parliament, a letter to the Times, signed by 70 leading architects and artists, declared that, quote, artistic qualifications really make the architect, unquote. And these cannot be tested by examination.
There you go.
Yeah, how convenient.
It's not rationally proven, it cannot be taught, it cannot be learned.
The next year, these views were vigorously defended in a collection of essays aptly entitled Architecture, a Profession or an Art? A profession or an art, that's interesting. Yeah. So they consider that to be as two separate things.
So if you're an artist, you're not professional.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's like, what did they say about Andrew Wyeth? Sentimental or sophisticated? I think it was a cover of Art News, was it? Sentimental or sophisticated?
You cannot be sophisticated if you're sentimental.
Yeah.
By the end of the 19th century, those who thought of the architect primarily as an artist would come to view iron, glass, and reinforced concrete simply as new opportunities for individual artistic expression. As if that makes any sense at all.
No, but well, again, yes and no. Of course you can use it, but it's how you use it.
No, but it makes sense in the way that the art side of things, they always want to do things cheap and easy.
And because it's new, not because it can be used or has some qualities.
But at the same time, that many architects were making creative use of new materials and ordering prefabricated wood or iron pillars, panels, doors, windows, and ornamental work, the need for the traditional craft skills of the master mason and stone carver and the cabinet maker and wood carver declined even further. Right. Thus, the building arts followed the arts of pottery, weaving, and glassblowing in a steadily diminishing need for the inventive and multi-talented craftsperson. Exactly. As the ideal of the artist reached new spiritual heights in the course of the 19th century, and the craftsperson's skill became increasingly superfluous, the gap between the image and status of the artist and the artisan became even wider than ever.
But it's funny that the artist types also typically are on the left, but the way of thinking is typical of industrial capitalism. Because I remember I visited Boris once, and he was going to have an exhibition in the museum. And there was a historical museum. And they talked about, there was a ship yard there. I think it was the 1720s or 1740s, which was one of the first shipyards where they mass-produced ships. So they just, I guess not with machines like that, but there was a mass production, standardized production. So at least by 1740s, they're already starting that in the industry. And then so the artists, then, because they want to be artists, these architects follow up in that.
Yeah, but you're saying it started with the ships and then goes over to...
Yeah, that these people who shall live for art, and if they're poor, that means they are true and so, but they follow in the industrial capitalist mindset way of producing things. That's such irony.
Yeah, but that's the thing all over, that the thing they hate the most, they're kind of in bed with it already, and that's why they hate it. Mm. So it's a deep Jungian problem here.
What Americans call deep Freudian shit.
Yes.
Yeah.
I saw something interesting here that I had put a mark on. Larry Scheiner writes that although the term disinterestedness has never been part of everyday talk about the fine arts, the general idea of an unprejudiced, contemplative attitude toward art continued to make its way among both the public and those who wrote about art.
Yeah. So
yeah, it's even though no one uses that word, that's what they're doing.
No, and that's the thing. They might not even know who Kant ever was, and they talk like him.
They call it contemplation is a word they can accept, but disinterestedness, no one ever admits to themselves that they look disinterestedly at a work.
Yeah. So like here, and this is okay. We say figurative or classical, whatever. But just look at, if you really go into it, you look at everything is painted the same way, which flattens the whole image. So he was probably not aware of Kant at all, but just that way of thinking, you should not dramatize and make it more with more pathos. Well, then you start just putting paint on. It doesn't matter how it's done, and then you get disinterestedness, even though you're not aware of the term.
And they're also probably very inspired by the ideas that Kant launched about the form is more important than the content
and the pure color.
Yeah, that's
superior to the mixed color.
That it's something. Yeah, Kant writes that if it's something circular, and you recognize that it's let's say a clock, then it loses its our interest in it because we recognize what it is. So you want something to be in the shape of a clock, but not describe it as a clock, just the shape.
Yeah.
And that's what you're showing there with when things become patches of color.
Yeah.
Not describing what those patches of colors are.
But that's a traditional thing. But here it's really starting to actually paint like that also. Yeah. But it's still figurative, where you could say a classical if you want to stretch the term quite long.
And what we're talking about here is very it's very necessary that we bring this up, because this is
1893.
This is the silent history of art.
Yeah.
that they never bring up. They talk as if Impressionism is something that just had to appear. That doesn't have a connection with the past. But of course it does.
That's a genius term. That's a brilliant term. The silent history of art.
Yeah.
All of these starters that are, of course you couldn't say are pure modern art, but it goes in that direction.
After 1848, there was a steady expansion of specialized art institutions such as the dealer, critic, curator, collector complex for painting, and similar supports.
Dealer.
Yeah. Dealer, critic, curator, collector complex.
Yeah, I was just thinking about drug dealer.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
And similar support complexes for music and literature. Now, success as a writer, composer, or painter meant recognition by one of these art, music, or literary worlds.
Who do not paint themselves.
Yes, that's going back to Kant and who is allowed to judge. It's someone who is not in touch with what they're looking at. Someone who hasn't gotten their hands dirty.
Because they're more objective.
And they work with the mind. Like these people, they write. They use their pure imagination. They're not in touch with something sensual.
Yeah.
The period from roughly 1800 to 1830 seems to have been the moment of final consolidation and elevation. Certainly by the mid-19th century, the term art had not only come to designate a category of fine arts, poetry, painting, music, etc., but also an autonomous realm of works and performances, values, and institutions. The ideal of the artist as creator was viewed as a kind of religious calling, sometimes raised to the status of prophet and priest, as we heard from the quotes, but also allowing for the poet poses of dandy or bohemian alongside martyr and rebel. Finally, works of art, as the fixed creations of inspired imagination, were to be reverently attended to aesthetically, for themselves, a state of mind and behavior steadily inculcated in concert audiences and museum visitors. The shadow side of the 19th century elevation of art was the further demotion of the crafts and popular arts, the reduction of many artisans to industrial operatives, and an increased separation of the audiences for fine and popular arts. By the end of the 19th century, the great division of the 18th century had become a gulf. And I guess that means that they have become
greater
connected.
Separation.
Okay, yeah. You had something?
Yeah, I was just thinking about it. This is immediately you wouldn't think of this as modernistic. This one here, because it has a sober grayness to it and so. But then you start looking at the sort of horizon line here that comes next to her knees instead of behind her, or the shadow on her, which is from her, which is immediately next to her. So it's like a photo shadow almost, which flattens the whole form, and everything, of course, is flat in the wrong way. And so you could say that this is not. You couldn't say it's modernism as such, but again, that aesthetical indifference comes in. There's no sentimentality, no pathos at all, and it goes in that direction.
Like
so
you using the shadow, you can achieve a lot of you can achieve a dramatic effect like the film noir.
Yeah, well, that's why you have one of the major improvements, and the Greeks had ideas of improvements, not progress but improvements. One major painter was called Apollodorus, the shadow painter. Then suddenly you get form, volume.
And speaking of these painters, and perhaps even a bit before them, I guess, because now we come to the topic of photography, and I'm not going to read too much about it. He has a whole chapter on it, but to mention it briefly is worth it. So on January 7th, 1839, the astronomer François Arago, I don't know how you spell it, presented Louis Daguerre's discovery of photography to a special session of the French Academy of Sciences. Over the next months, Daguerre demonstrated and publicized his invention around Paris, and the French government finally agreed to purchase the patent rights and make them public property. As the excitement over the new process spread, the painter Paul de la Roche is supposed to have exclaimed, "From this day, painting is dead." As it turned out, painting still had a long career ahead of it, including a remarkable phase of realism. Initially, the French and English press had been in no doubt that a marvelous new fine art medium had been discovered. Yet the limitations of photography as an art medium soon became apparent. Not only the lack of color, but also the troubling fact that a machine did most of the work. Painters such as Delaroche and Eugène Delacroix soon saw that photography would hardly replace painting, but could become a useful aid for such things as recording difficult poses of live models. Although photography did not kill off painting in the years following 1839, some kinds of functional painting did decline and virtually disappear, such as the affordable miniature portrait, whose makers either quit or became photographers or tinters in photographic shops. And I've heard people say this before, that the reason why painting declined was because of the photography.
That and the First World War.
Yeah, and it's not true at all. One thing is true though, that something rather ridiculous happened after the photography was invented, and that was that the painting started to compete on the premises of photography. Because the photography, it captures exactly what's there. And then you should think that the painters, instead of trying to compete with the camera and make everything realistic, naturalistic, that's the period of naturalism that comes after this. Instead of that, they should elevate painting to the to its rightful what can I say, realm. Yeah. Where painting the benefits of painting comes clearly forward, like with Titian or Rembrandt, that it can evoke something that photography is not able to.
Yeah, again, if they had a secure standing in the classical values and knowing what classical values are,
yeah.
It's the thing about the people who kept running even though the automobile came.
Yeah, these car races exist.
Yeah. And
but you could also say that painters exist. They have just been so diminished and had a very, very rough time. And sprinters haven't had a rough time in the same way. They haven't been.
No, but it hasn't been a subject to a philosophical attack.
Yeah. So the photography is really a side issue here.
I think you can absolutely say it might have something to do with it, but it wouldn't have if it weren't for the whole backdrop of the aesthetic attack, the German attack on classical values.
Yeah, but what do you think? Do you think if photography had not been invented, I guess it's difficult to imagine, but if you try to imagine a world without photography, would modernism still have happened?
It appears so.
I think so. Yeah. I don't see.
I mean, it's the same thing as you can see those photography or First World War, whatever, and the industrialization. The science is obviously improving, and that sort of became contagious. There are certain sort of purely mechanical factors like that, but they wouldn't be as important if there wasn't for the philosophical backdrop. You have to have that first.
Yeah, but then again, I'm thinking. So with the photography, you get naturalism in painting. So it's a childish reaction to photography, and then it becomes a bit meaningless to paint because you're just you're as mechanical as a photograph with color. Yeah, that's the only thing they could.
Yeah, but if they had really known what the classical values were, and understood that was not the point for the old masters, they wouldn't react like that.
But you could say that when they then reacted in that way and naturalism became the thing in painting, then the reaction to that was the early modernists or the early impressionists who wanted painting to be something more than a mechanical reproduction of reality.
Yeah, so they get tricked into thinking it's either something spiritual or it's really good craft.
Yeah.
But the Old Master, of course, is a mix of so-called spirituality through storytelling and good craft.
And that's where the philosophy comes into this, that yes, naturalism happens because of the photography, but we could have come back to something old masterly again if it hadn't been for the whole build-up from the 18th century with the fine art system.
Yeah, so that would have a greater impact. Yeah, if one thing is if photography wasn't invented, but if German aesthetical philosophy wasn't invented and photography came later, you would have a much better situation.
Yeah. And now we get to the chapter about modernism. And it's kind of like in the book too. It's like, okay, here suddenly there's
modernism.
A rapid change. Yeah.
Yeah, that's.
And I'm not going to. I hate mentioning the names, so I'm going to skip the names. Yeah,
you can read it and you bleep it afterwards when you edit it.
Yeah, I have another method which is more.
Okay.
More what do you say? Pleasant. Although notoriously hard to define and date, the establishment of modernism is often identified with the period 1890 to 1930, which witnessed a profound stylistic disruption of representational modes in painting. Traditional narrative techniques in the novel, the standard tonal system in music. Classical balletic movements in the dance, and traditional architectural forms. If the characteristics and timing of modernism are hard to pin down, so are the larger social and cultural forces that fed into it. Many historians have seen modernism as an artistic response to the rapid industrialization and urbanization of the late 19th century. A profound social disruption that led to the paradoxical extremes of a belief in limitless progress and a growing sense of anomie. The horrors of World War I soon exploded the belief in progress, but did not slow the pace of technological and social change or their disorienting effects. The poet T.S. Eliot caught the darkened mood of the post-war era in one of the defining works of modernist literature, The Wasteland. Quote, "Son of man, you know only a heap of broken images." Unquote.
Fragmentation. Fragmentation.
Yeah. Yeah, everything is fragmented, as we talked about before. The painting, well, before modernism, the painting was either, it's a still life, it's a portrait, it's a landscape, instead of being a unified whole. And the same thing with the architect, or the master builder, let's call it the master builder. And then you split it into designer and engineer. So there is no one who has the full overarching arching view anymore. Yet modernism and its theorists did not radically alter the basic beliefs of the fine art system so much as encourage a shift of emphasis within them. Modernist experiments with abstraction, multiple points of view, and atonality helped finish off such secondary criteria for defining fine art as imitation and beauty, opening the way to their replacement by more complex versions of expressionist and formalist theories. To call something beautiful was coming to seem a weak compliment compared with descriptions such as significant, complex, and challenging. Now the ideal of creative vision was explicitly opposed to representation, function, and beauty. And you could say that one of the major problems here is that term beauty, because it has become so vague, and it's just something you say about something you like. And when when things in society become too when they are no longer have a philosophical background to support them, something will take over.
Mm.
A little bit like the Muslims in Europe. Okay, they're coming here, but we don't have a culture to stand up for ourselves. So we're
Well, at best, the West hates itself. That's the big problem.
So that's more of a problem than the Muslims actually coming here.
Yeah, definitely.
We are like we have an open chest. Our intestines are exposed, and someone can come and grab them. The analogy was a bit bad there, but okay.
No, but it's completely true. It's the problem is not if you're the same thing in the figurative painting. People are angry about the bloody modernists and we are the true artists and so on, but it's not about them. Let them do what they're doing. But the problem is that you're not aware enough of what you are doing, and then you get that mix back and forth.
And of course, you have to understand their background to understand
certainly
your situation.
Certainly.
As a theory of art, formalism was already implicit in Kant's and Schiller's call for the disinterested contemplation of form. And in the 1850s, Edward Hanslick argued that what makes music a fine art are its formal patterns of harmony and melodic structure. Music is something, quote, self-contained and in no need of content from outside itself, unquote.
Yeah, exactly. I remember one of the first painters I saw or seeked out, like a local painter in Norway, was in my hometown, was sort of that in-between situation. And one of the things he told me that remember that art is a world in itself.
Mm.
Isn't like some town in some country no one's ever heard of. He speaks like Kant.
Yeah, and
what do you
that's how you can have an architect who says that preferably no one should live in these buildings. Consisting, quote, solely of tones and their artistic combination, unquote. So, content doesn't mean anything. Aristotle is the opposite. He says that music is an imitation of nature. Yeah. So that's the view on the other side. By the end of the 19th century, art historians such as Riegel and Heinrich Wölfflin had developed a complex formalist approach to the visual arts. And critics such as Roger Fry and Clive Bell were soon defending post-impressionist and cubist painting as well as primitive carvings by arguing that what makes something art is the formal exploration of line, color and composition, not representational content or beauty. Although modernists produced a bewildering variety of manifestos and programs, which the naturalists did not. One recurring motif was the special importance many ascribed to purity of medium. And this thing about the purity is, of course, from Kant. One painter, not going to mention his name, caught this aspect of the modernist ethos with particular acuity in an essay of 1920. Quote, at present, each art strives to express itself more directly through its plastic means and seeks to free its means as much as possible. Music tends toward the liberation of sound. Literature toward the liberation of word. Painting expresses pure relationship, unquote. Henceforth, true art for most of the modernists was to be the pure art of abstraction or experimentalism. Even so, not all artists interpreted it as art for art's sake, but like believed abstraction would unite all the fine and applied arts and lead to a better world. Yeah. No, it's the absurdity is enormous here. The embrace of atonality and dissonance was only one among innumerable modernist innovations in music, as composers from this and that composer explored new chromatic structures and rhythms. To listeners brought up on the major-minor tonal system, the music produced by these highly rational techniques actually sound random and meaningless. Serialism, more than other modernist experiments with tonality, timbres and rhythms, was a pure abstract music which lent itself especially well to formalist justifications. A deep split developed between the most abstract and experimental of the new composers and traditional audiences. Yet serialism was always considered part of art music, even by those who didn't like it. Its problem was less one of assimilation into the category of fine art than of acceptance by the existing classical music audience. Even so, conductors began to insert modern pieces among the traditional Baroque and Romantic favorites, and people learned to take their modernist medicine with stoic silence and polite applause. And that's how it is today. We always, when I go to the concert hall in Oslo, we always have to listen to a modernist piece before the real thing starts. And even in the break, they play this. In the entire break, they play this modernist piece. So you have to listen to it.
I remember I was going to Opera in Vienna with Boris. We were going to listen to Johnny Skicki, and then we had to listen to Schoenberg's Jakobsleiter first. That was before the break, so people don't leave in the breaks.
Oh. Yeah, and let me see, where are we here now? European culture, traumatized by the slaughter of World War I and the revolutionary aftermath that brought fascism to Italy and communism to Russia, was again deeply shaken in the 1930s by the Great Depression and the rise of Hitler and Stalin. And this is interesting. In such a climate, many artists and critics in both Europe and the Americas turned away from modernist abstraction and experimentalism toward representational styles they thought would be better able to carry a political message. And like you talked with Michael Pierce, this is now in our time, it's always connected to Soviet and Nazi Germany, and also China, communist China. But this was also a trend in general in Europe and America.
Yeah, and that's maybe one weakness with China's book, that it doesn't mention the Cultural Investment Agency, CIA, and the whole abstract expressionist, and FDR's involvement with the Museum of Modern Art as the flagship of modernism.
Yeah, that's a great supplement to Larry Shiner's book.
Yeah.
This thing about, as Michael Pierce mentioned, that the Museum of Modern Art was announced by the President of the United States in 1939 as the flagship of America, that this is our new identity.
Yep.
It's like you wouldn't even think, you wouldn't have ever thought that was that it was possible that the president would do something like that.
Yeah, and also,
I mean. If you wouldn't know that, you think it's just a natural, but like a progress into modernism. Eventually modernism takes over, but it was this defined, there was this date when it was announced on the radio for the entire American people.
Yeah, and if there are any representational painters who vote somehow left and are very concerned with the strong state, they should know that all the problems that we have wouldn't be here if the state hadn't gone in and made all of these art institutions and like what you just mentioned too.
Yeah, and we're getting to some of that now soon, I think. It's something that Larry Shiner doesn't devote a lot of time to, but he touches on it. After World War II, the art worlds of music, literature and painting returned to the internal struggles of modernism. Although existentialism in France provided a focus for a socially concerned literature of an intensely individual type, In the United States, the preoccupation with social issues and the use of representational styles fell quickly into disfavor in both literature and painting, as modernist experimentation revived and triumphed thanks partly to lessons learned during the 1940s from the many European exiles. But by then it was a culture war between the Soviets and the Americans. The Soviets had the social realist painting, and the Americans had the avant-garde, which was supposedly symbolized freedom. Yeah, abstract art is the idiom of the free world.
Yeah.
It's a quote here. In the 1950s, modernism and formalism got an unexpected boost from the Cold War, with the memory of Hitler and Nazis still fresh, and with Stalin's culture minister Andrei Zhdanov once again publicly condemning formalism as a sign of capitalist decadence. Modernism and formalism now carried the cachet of anti-totalitarianism, acting as a surrogate for the US government. The Museum of Modern Art supported traveling exhibitions of abstract expressionist paintings as a sign of America's creative freedom and artistic leadership, in contrast to the communist bloc's censorship and stagnation.
So it does mention it, yeah.
Yeah.
But
well, he doesn't mention that moment with President Roosevelt announcing it on the radio. But it's interesting, he mentions Andrei Zhdanov here, and I'm not sure, are you familiar with the Zhdanov doctrine?
I've heard of it, I can't remember right now.
It was imposed on the composers in Soviet...
Where formalism comes...
Yes, in 1948.
Yeah.
So after the Second World War. Because, so this law, the Zhdanov doctrine, it said that you cannot use dissonances in the music. If I remember correctly, you're not allowed to use any. And Shostakovich was one of the composers that were prohibited, or his music was prohibited. And also the music by, oh god, the names, Myaskovsky and yeah, some other composers I should remember now. And then Shostakovich had to write this piece, The Song of the Forests, for Stalin's 70th birthday, which was the year afterwards. And that work is completely without dissonances. And when you hear it, it doesn't sound like Shostakovich, almost at all. And it's said that he, afterwards, when it had premiered, afterwards he went to his hotel and he cried in his pillow, because he thought it was such a terrible thing to do to himself. But Stalin was happy, and he received the annual Stalin Prize for it. And then it loosened up after that. It was extreme that first year, 1948, 1949, and then it started loosening up slowly. But there's a reason why they made that law to begin with. It was that strong influence from America and Europe with the atonal tendencies that were, what do you say? It was plaguing, it came as a plague also to Russia. Yeah. The composers started to work more with dissonances than with consonances, and that's where it goes wrong when you use too many dissonances. There's no melodic anchor point in the music anymore.
Although I think if Rembrandt had lived under Stalin, he wouldn't get away with the Oath of the Batavians. Yeah,
but that's like you are left with only trash for the people who actually are appealing to the private sphere.
Yeah.
On both sides here. If you're in America and you're appealing to the private sphere with sensual images, you're out. And the same in Soviet Russia. You're out because you're not good as a political tool.
Right. So it's not figurative or abstract. It's
so you're just totally out of the game.
Yeah, it's public or private. That's the thing.
By the mid-1950s, New York had become the world mecca for the arts, and the American composers, writers, and artists were on the way to becoming international celebrities. In 1964, art in the United States received a major public consecration with the creation of the National Endowment for the Arts, followed by an unprecedented expansion in the number of galleries, museums, symphonies, dance and theater companies, arts festivals, literary journals and prizes, and local and state art councils. And Trump tried to get rid of the National Endowment of the Arts.
Yeah, he was quite close to doing it.
But he was stopped by the Republican Party.
Too well behaved.
That would have been a revolution, like an example to follow. Everyone follows America, we know that.
Yeah.
Trump, if he had gotten rid of that, it would have been maybe a revolution here in Europe with a more. I mean, the government has. They are destroying the market. Because they're giving so much money to people who make nonsense.
Yeah, they're creating a false market and flooding the market. Yeah. But I mean, when he won over Clinton, I thought, well, if Trump can win over the Clinton machine, then we can win over the art machine. It is possible.
Mm-hmm. But that it's in America. Everyone looks to America. That's the thing. Things, I mean, other things are
things change.
But still, it's like Michael Diamant said about the architectural uprising, that if he showed examples from Eastern European countries or other countries that people don't really respect, it wouldn't be received so well. But if he showed examples of new classical architecture from America or England, or Germany, Berlin, then people aren't paying attention. Although the arts since 1970 had been categorized by a pluralism that defies generalization, it is fair to say that one major trend of the past 30 years has tried to reintegrate art with life, from the intimately personal to the broadly political. Yet, like a compulsive who must repeat the same actions over and over, Western culture has seemed unable to stop repeating the kind of division by which it originally split art into fine art versus craft and segregated art from the rest of society. It's a very interesting point here. That they kind of want to get out of it, but they can't get out of it. Because it's so rooted. And as we know, going back to the 18th century, it has a very, very thick root. You don't just get rid of overnight.
And that's why you have to get out of the art prison if you shall create a if you shall make a constructive alternative.
Yeah, and then words play into it, but of course that just one part of it.
So just to show one example, just on one point, about the importance of knowing the values, so that you don't go in blind and be blind. This is Axel Kalla, 1896. You see here. Then he breaks the figure completely off on the background, and then the clouds become separate abstract shapes. Which is sort of an artification trick to show that you're modern, right?
Is it clouds or is it something else?
Yes, and to him the clouds are red and violence are blue and I love you are.
So to show how far this would go, there's an interesting little anecdote here that Larry Scheiner mentions. So low had the value of craft skill sunk in some quarters by the early 1990s that when an abstract sculptor, who was a much admired wood sculptor, was complimented by an interviewer on his superb craftsmanship, he quickly changed the subject, as if sensing that his status as an artist was in danger.
Yeah. And that's interesting, because then you're starting to come to a period where also the artists that really are true artists, this movement has become so dominant that they don't have to be so intellectual anymore, because of course, like with Bleep, we made a conversation on Kandinsky, right? That's sort of intellectual, at least he is able to write and explain. But once that becomes dominant, you can just follow.
But that's why we
I
are
mean,
now...
that he's changed the subject, he didn't argue against it.
We are now in the driver's seat.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's our advantage, that we have to know more than they do.
And we do.
Yeah.
Signs of discontent with modernism already began to surface in the 1960s as books such as Jane Jacobs' The Death and Life of Great American Cities revealed the bankruptcy of an urban renewal policy that bulldozed whole neighborhoods and replaced them with antiseptic high-rises, and Robert Venturi's Complexity and Contradiction in Modern Architecture criticized the boring reductivism of the modernist style. By the 1970s, the post-modern movement was underway with the return of exterior decoration, columns, peaked roofs, cupolas, bas-reliefs, and color. Like many stylistic movements, post-modernism produced some distinguished buildings and should be credited with restoring the idea that buildings can also be fun. For example, Michael Graves' Hotel for Walt Disney World, with the giant swans and scallop shells on top. But a lot of postmodernism was primarily a stylistic shift, a matter of surface aesthetics and in-jokes for the art historical crowd, rather than a deep reformation of either architecture or the image of the architect as sovereign artist. By now, postmodernism has given way to an exuberant pluralism in architecture, as in the other arts, so that buildings can look like anything from geometric cubes to exploding sculptural fantasies. I've always disagreed with this view, that we're still in postmodernism. Because it's just modernism all over. It's just a different branch of modernism. Or it is at the same time very, very similar. It's not really that different.
Same shit, different wrapping.
Yeah. And it's strange here that he touches on postmodernist architecture, although never mentioning any of the architects, but it doesn't mention Vincent Desiderio, Odd, and I don't know about Stephen Assail. Was he a so-called postmodernist?
Well,
he's a bit later, I guess, but he doesn't even mention Philip Glass or Arvo Pärt.
Andrew Wyeth.
Or Andrew Wyeth, yeah. Or this other Polish composer, Gorecki and Penderecki. So that's a weakness, because, yeah, it's an interesting period, but he's right when he says that it didn't have a deep philosophical root, or he said something similar. That's the problem. And Erik Norino was here from the Architecture Uprising. He was also concerned about now that they're gaining momentum, the Architecture Uprising movements in Scandinavia and especially in Sweden. But are they really? Do they really have a solid foundation?
Yeah.
So that this doesn't just become a fashion, and then we turn our eyes somewhere else. Yeah, so now we come to the conclusion of the book. Almost done here. As recently as 50 years ago, there were influential artists and critics ready to deny the name art to any work of literature, painting, or music that did not participate in the modernist quest for purity.
And they should have succeeded.
Yes, to make it clear for us. Yeah. Clement Greenberg and those people. Since then, two forms of assimilation have converged to explode the category of art. On the one hand, movements within the fine arts have been able to turn almost any conceivable material, sound, or activity into art and get it accepted by art institutions. On the other hand, fine art institutions themselves have used the art versus craft polarity to divide and appropriate everything from so-called primitive art to jazz and the new journalism.
Appropriation is the term.
The arts have always had multiple functions, and among them, education has been central. Horace's please and instruct. Arthur Danto's rethinking of the cognitive role of art as embodied meaning has proved especially useful for illuminating some of the maddest and murkiest corners of the fine art world of the last half-century. Whereas Dante's philosophy still wrestles primarily with how to define art in the light of changes in the visual arts, Karol Berger focuses directly on the issue of function, refreshingly approaching it from the perspective of music and literature. For Berger, the highest function of the arts is to represent fictional words in ways that gives a new understanding of ourselves and our surroundings. Although versions of this view can be traced from Aristotle to Schiller and Hegel, Berger's theory does not make edification a characteristic of the fine arts alone, but recognizes a continuum between the everyday art and high arts. Moreover, he deftly meets the greatest challenge for any contemporary mimetic view of the arts, the modernist drive toward abstraction, experimentation, and lack of closure, arguing that modernism itself mirrors the exhilarating and terrible freedom of the modern self to define its own identity. That's an interesting point. That we have become a people, a society without an identity. And that is what is being reflected in the museums. We go there to look at our own lack of identity.
Yeah, and what the fine art system did was to sever or try to sever the ties with anything that is eternal, which means that it's impersonal and objective. Criteria for craft and our connection to seeing our lives in an internal mythic or storytelling perspective.
Yeah. And that causes the identity crisis. And people have a full-blown identity crisis now, and I mean, it's in this book, and it's obvious that the culture has been led totally astray. We have a deep problem here, and the people on the right side of politics, they're just explaining the surface. They're just complaining about the surface of things here.
Yeah.
They're just ridiculing the people who don't know what kind of gender they are and all of that. But that's not helping anyone. We need a constructive alternative. So, at the end here, a third system of art transcending the divisions of the modern fine art system has yet to establish itself. But even if it were possible in some wild anti-art dream to dismantle existing institutions and replace the one-sided ideals of fine art with the norms of craft and popular art, we would simply be reversing an individuous polarity rather than healing a fracture that occurred long ago. The answer to art divided is obviously not to reject such ideals as freedom, imagination, and creativity, but to unite them with facility, service, and function. That's a good point. Yet there is no magic formula for the correct balance. There is. It would be silly to demand that every piece of music, literature, or visual art manifest an equal dose of imagination and skill, form and function, spiritual and sensual pleasure. Of
course, because not everyone is that skilled to be able to do that.
Yeah. In this book, I have tried to show that fine art, as we have generally understood it, is neither eternal nor ancient, but a historical construction of the 18th century, and I have traced a parallel tradition of resistance extending down to the present. I am also aware that you can't go home again. We cannot resurrect the old system of art. Nor can we simply wish away the break that split apart the old system of art, arrogating intellect, imagination, and grace to fine art and disparaging craft and popular culture as the realm of mere technique, utility, entertainment, and profit. Like other dualisms that have plagued our culture, the divisions of the fine art system can only be transcended through a continuing struggle. I believe we do transcend them in practice from time to time. What is harder is naming and articulating what we have done. And he thinks that we cannot resurrect the old system of art, but of course not in exactly the same way. But it's absolutely possible. That's what they did in the Renaissance. They resurrected the old system of art, to use that term.
Again, you have to be philosophically aware so that you know what you're going to resurrect. So you don't think that it's about painting old-fashioned or like a photo or all these idiotic ideas.
Yeah. But then it's also, at the end here, interesting to ask what has happened since Larry Shiner wrote this book. He wrote it in 2001.
It was published in 2001, yeah.
Yeah, that's 20 years ago. It's quite the same, perhaps a bit worse. I don't know, what do you think?
I remember I was at this discussion when they were talking about Odd. And they made a point out of that everything was allowed. But there was with this, okay, yeah, you can exist, fine, whatever, I don't care. Completely indifferent to the classical way of thinking. And that's why I keep coming back to that. If you shall make an alternative, you have to do it outside of art somehow. But then you have to know what art is, you have to know what the classical values are. We are proposing kitsch, of course, but get away from art. That's the first fundamental step.
And the world has become so fragmented now, way more fragmented even than when Shiner wrote this book. Because everyone is living, like Odd describes it sometimes, everyone is living in their little puddle with fish. And you think you're connected to the whole world, but it's actually a little puddle where you're having fun with your followers. And no one else in the world. Like, if one of our videos gets 1 million views somewhere, my neighbor doesn't even exist. My neighbor doesn't even know that the channel exists. And this is a great problem. We're not connected with the society around us. It's an inflationary world where we think that we have a lot of impact on society, but it's so fragmented. It's just these lonely islands everywhere. So that's a big problem, and it's way bigger than when he wrote that book. So now more than ever, to try to get into the system of art is a waste of time.
Yeah, but then it's a question of reading books like Larry Shiner's The Invention of Art, and if one person there or one person there, one person there does it, those are the people that you need to reach, that really understand it. It's so important that you understand that it's to say that Rembrandt is not an artist. It's not a polemical point. It's an actual empirical point. He did not make art. So if you want to go back to that, you have to get rid of the art term.
Amen.